Okay, so now that we know a little bit about functions and how functions work, let's actually use them in a practical sense. So this week's assignment, and you'll see this video separately on the actual assignment page, is to create a color picker app. I'm going to hit play on this video so you can see how this works. But basically, you have some sliders that you're going to move around, and what's actually happening here is every time a slider is moved, a function is being executed. So every time slider's moved even a little bit, a function is being called, and that function is changing the background color value of this button. Okay? Then once I click that apply button, that is the function being called again, a different function, and that one is applying it to the background. And then I have a bright and a dark. I'm going to rewind it a little bit. I have a bright in the background and a dark in the background button in the bottom, and those are also functions. Okay, and as I hit those, functions are being executed to brighten and functions are being executed to darken. All right, so putting that aside, we're going to start by actually talking about some new objects in our project. I'm going to start just by making a new single view app. I'm going to call this objects library. Make sure it's in storyboard, and I'll just save this to my usual places. I'm going to go to my main.storyboard file in the project navigator, and I'm going to probably switch my view to an iPhone SE just so it's a little faster. Okay, so here's our view. Let's go ahead and hide our project navigator. Hopefully by now you're feeling pretty comfortable with the tools and how to navigate around the interface here. So far we've really just been using buttons and labels and text fields, right? Which are very simple. We have a text field, which is an input. We have a button, which is a function or an action. And we have labels, which are kind of like outputs, right? That's pretty much how we've been using these for the last 2 weeks of class. Let's talk about some of the other things that you see in apps. Go ahead and click the plus in the upper right-hand corner to get to your object library, and you have all those objects. And I asked you to play with them in previous weeks, but I'm going to go over how you actually use some of these in code. Let's start by just dragging a label into our scene, our good old friendly label that we love to play with. And let's hit the plus again, and I'm going to add a slider into the scene. So slider, I could either type that in or find it in that list and just drag and drop that into your scene. I'm going to make the slider a little bit bigger, so I'm just going to kind of pull it over here, pull it over here. And what you're going to notice whenever you have the slider selected is the attribute inspector looks a little bit different than it does for label. There's something called value. I'm going to zoom in on this, which is basically what's the starting value of the slider. And if you mouse over these, it'll tell you information. The minimum, so the far left value, so whenever it's all the way over here, it's at 0. And the maximum, whenever it's all the way on the right, it's at 1. We can even have an image that appears whenever it's on the minimum, or an image that appears whenever it's on the maximum. We can change the colors. So for instance, if we do this color for the min track, and we'll just do like blue for the max track, notice that it changes the sides. So if you move this slider, it'll dynamically move those. Really fun. I'm going to put those back at default for now. Thumb tent, which is the actual thing's tent. And if we scroll down, there's lots and lots and lots of other options. Okay. The ones that are most important for us is this value. So a slider, if the minimum is 0 and the max is 1, it's returning what kind of data? What kind of data do you think it's returning? If this side's 0, this side's 1, and it's starting at 0.5.
Oh, double?
Yeah, so it's returning a double value, right, out of this. So as you slide this around, it's giving you different values from it. Let's add a switch to our scene. Drag and drop that in. You probably recognize the switch. This is very commonly used in pretty much every app. And whenever we have that selected, let's look at the attributes inspector for this one. All right, so we have this state right here. It says on and off. What do you guess that is?
It's telling me whether or not it's on or off. It's its natural state, right? Where it's like that's its default.
Yeah, that's what it's on whenever the app loads, basically. And in fact, if you hover your mouse over this, a Boolean value that determines the on-off state of the switch. And it even gives us the code for it a little bit. I'm going to show you how to find that code a little more. On tent, so we could change this green to be something else. And off tent or thumb tent. So there's other things in here that you can play with, but that's a switch. Let's hit this plus and find one other one. Let's find stepper. Let's drag and drop stepper into our scene. And a stepper, which recently changed how it looks, by the way. If you have an older version of iOS, this looks totally different. But a stepper is a plus and a minus. You've seen this in other apps too, where you might be adding something or subtracting something. Whenever we select it and we look on the right-hand side, we see, look at that, the same kind of thing. We have value, so the starting value, the minimum, so it's at 0. So if I hit this minus, nothing's going to happen. Whenever I hit the plus, it has a maximum of 100. And the step is each tap, how much does it add to that value? So each time, so I'd have to tap this 100 times to reach the top. Okay? There's other behaviors in here that you can play with. So how did I just explore those? Well, basically, I dragged and dropped them into the scene. I clicked them, and I just read what they were on the right-hand side. I could also go to the quick help, right, which tells me lots of information, maybe a little too much information, but it gives you, some good data. But that's basically it. I want you to experiment by adding things to your scene and then looking at them in the attributes inspector. Let's talk about how we get these into the code. I'm going to go ahead and open up my project navigator. I'm going to hold Option and click on the view controller .swift file so that it opens that up, and I'm just going to hide that project navigator. I'm going to hide my attribute inspector as well, so I have a little bit more screen real estate to work with. So let's see what happens whenever we try to connect the slider to code. Let's drag it and release and see what happens. It defaults to an action, right? And something else on here called event, which we haven't talked about events yet. But events are basically what causes the action to trigger. In this case, it's value changed. And we could click this and see all kinds of things. For example, touch down means they've tapped it. Touch up inside means they've tapped it. There's a bunch of other ones. Did they drag? Did they touch and drag on it? But value change means that somebody tapped this and moved it. So every time someone taps this and then moves the slider, the value changes, and this action will trigger. Let's call this value changed. Hit connect. Let's connect it again and see if it can be connected as an outlet. Because remember, an action is like a function. And look at that. It can be connected as an outlet. And it's of the type UI slider, and we'll give it a name. I'll call it my slider. So it's just like a label, connects just like a label does. Let's go ahead and connect our label as well as an outlet. So I'm going to just drag my label over, and I'm going to call it my label. And we're just going to use the label as kind of like a way to output some data. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a few lines to our value changed function. And in this function, I'm going to write a function really simply that takes the data from my slider and outputs it to my label. So we're going to do what we've done a million times. We're going to write mylabel.text equals, and let's start typing in my slider. Because how do you know what the property is, right? With mylabel.text is the property, and it's very easy to find that it's .text, right? And with buttons, or not buttons, with the text fields, it was also .text. But with the slider, I want you to hit a dot and then pause. And this is a way to exploratorily, like as you're just kind of exploring the software, see and scroll through and just kind of look at a couple of these things in here. I'm going to help you out. This color and this icon indicates some really important information. The green V, that's a variable. The blue M, that's a method, which is another name for function. Yeah, that's right. Functions have 3 names: actions, functions, and methods. They're all interchangeable. It's very annoying. Method technically refers to something that already exists, but it's a function. So we're probably not looking for a function, so we can kind of rule out the blue ones. Let's just sort of scroll through. Okay, here's one. This one's called maximum value. All right, well, I don't really want that. This one's called self. That's not really that useful. Let's keep scrolling. This one's just called value. As I scroll down. This is the type, by the way, and the type is a float. I'm going to explain what a float is in a second. Well, let's go ahead and click that. Let's click value, and look, it actually tells me the slider's current value. Let's hit return, and it's going to give us that error, and it's the classic error that we've gotten 100 times. We can't assign a type float to a type string because mylabel.text wants a string. This is a float. Here's a little quiz. How would we convert this to a string?
Would we do string and then put parentheses around my slider.value?
Yep, exactly. It's just like we have used before. So I'll write string, parentheses, my slider.value. So we need to convert that to a string, and now we're good to go. By the way, just as a little note, a float is really just a decimal place. It's the same thing as a double. Unfortunately, in computer science, we've been using a bunch of different ways to calculate what decimal places are. Double is a sort of newer way of calculating a decimal place. Float was an old way. We're going to be using CG floats in this project, which I know doesn't make anything simpler, but the best way to remember this is that a float is just it's a decimal number. So 1.0, things like that. So it's not an int, it's not a whole number. Okay. So we've converted it. Let's hit play. And let's move the slider. All right, let's move the slider around. And look at that. So what's happening as we're moving this slider?
The numbers are changing.
Yeah, so the numbers change in the label, right? Which is our dot value of that slider. And how did we find that dot value? Like, how did we know that that thing named value existed? The way that I just did it was I hit dot after my slider, and I scrolled through and kind of looked around and found something. I'm going to show you another method with the next thing that we do. But yeah, as you drag this around, it very simply changes the number. Cool. Let's hit stop. So that's the basics of the slider. Let me just kind of close some of this. Let's connect the switch now. So I'm going to click on my switch, going to right-click and drag and see how it connects by default. And similar to the slider, it connects as an action by default. And it has the same event type too. It's value changed. So when someone taps it and it changes its value, we do it. So let's call this my switch and hit return. And let's also connect it as an outlet because we might want to look at what the data is that's held on here. Let's call this, oh, you know what? Sorry, let me redo that. I'll leave this in even though that was an error. I accidentally named this my switch. Let's rename this. I'm going to just delete that line. Make sure I go into my connections tab. So I'm going to select it, go to my connections tab, go ahead and remove that value change there, reconnect it, because I want to use a verb. I got a little sloppy there. We'll call this switch tapped. All right, that's a little bit better. We also need to connect it as an outlet because we want to see what kind of data we can pull from this thing. So let's connect it and let's name this, again, as an outlet. We'll go ahead and name this my switch. So we have switch tapped as the function, my switch as the outlet. Let's do the same thing. My label dot text equals, and let's, instead of this time, so last time we typed in my slider dot and we scrolled through that big list, let's go to the documentation page. I'm going to hold down Option or Alt on your keyboard and you change your mouse to the crosshair. And one of these up here says UI switch, or we can also click my switch, doesn't really matter. When we click it, it actually opens up the little help. And what I like to do is actually click this button that says Open in Developer Documentation. All right? Whenever I click that, it's going to open up this page. And on this page, I can scroll through and see some information. I can read the overview. Okay, cool. Value changed, event is generated, which results in sending an action message. Here's some of the topics. Here we go. Setting the on-off switch, initializing the switch object, customizing the appearance of the switch. This is whenever we can get into some really cool stuff. So these are all variables. So here's one called var on tint color. So we could have it where every time maybe we do this in a future project once we learn about how to generate random numbers, but we have it where every time you tap the switch, the tint color is randomized. So it's a different color every time or something like that. And there's other relationships, which we're going to talk about, inheritance and all those other things. But this is giving us all the options that we really care about. One of these is a var called isOn, and it's a bool. And this is the first Boolean we've worked with. And do you remember what a Boolean is?
It's a true-false statement.
Yeah, it's a true-false statement. So if we did, for example, let's go back to our project. My label.text equals my switch dot is on. Let's go ahead and convert that to a string, just like we did with the above one. Let's hit play. False, because it's off. Whenever I tap it, true, because it's on. Pretty cool, right? All right, last one, stepper. So let's right-click and drag stepper into our code and connect it. It wants to connect as an action. Same thing, value changed. It's when someone taps it up or when they tap it down and the value changes. So we'll call this stepper tapped. And let's also connect it again as an outlet. If you wanted to, you could go through most of the objects in the object library, which there's a lot of them, and figure out how these work. Let's call this my stepper. Oh, whoops, I connected that as an action. I'm going to undo that, which also means I have to delete it. And just double check the connections tab over here. So I'm just connecting this as an outlet called my stepper. So I have the stepper up here. I have the stepper tapped down here. And let's do the same thing. Let's type in my label.text equals my stepper. And you can use whatever method you want to find that value. So I'm going to do dot and scroll through because that's the way that I like to do it. Let's see. For me, I'm going to do dot value. This one returns a double. So like I don't know why my slider returns a float. This one returns a double, but that's what I'm going to use. So it's dot value for me. I'm going to wrap it up and with a string function to convert it, and we're good to go. Let's hit play and see how that works. So now we can tap and it goes up. We can tap and it goes down. We can slide this thing and change that. We can hit this to see true, false. So that's an introduction to a bunch of different objects. The last thing I'm going to show you is a super, super fun element of the object library menu. I'm going to go ahead and close out of this side tab and just have this main tab open. Hit the plus, and so far we've been using this tab to the left on this object library. Click the middle tab, which is the images tab, and here's all of the SF symbols, which this is a new thing that was added only a few months ago to Xcode. These are all vector-based images that you can search. So I could type in, let's say I want to add a sun, and here's a bunch of different suns, and I can drag and drop them into my scene, and boom, I have an image of a sun in my scene. And it's vector, so I can scale it up, and it works great. All right, so we have that little sun in there. I'm just going to delete that. I'm going to add a button to my scene, like a regular button from my object library. I'm going to drag and drop it. I'm going to show you how to make that sun clickable. So make sure you're on the right tab. You type in button, drop it in, and let's go to the inspector, the attribute inspector. And in the attribute inspector, one of these is called background, not the one called image, but the one called background. And if I click in that little drop down arrow, here I'll zoom in. Look at that. The whole system symbols are in there. I'm going to type in sun. I'll pick my sun. It replaces it. It's a little wonky. You have to kind of scale it around. We still have that text that says button, so I'm just going to go up here and delete that text. And now we have a fully interactive sun button. So that's what I want to leave you with, that there's also this massive library of images built into Xcode, as well as all these other things. So experiment with these, see what you can do, plug them into a label, read the documentation. I'm trying to give you the skills to figure this stuff out, so that in the future, if there's a new object added or you want to use, something like a picker, which is like what you use just like times in the alarms or a clock app, you can figure out how to do that.